Welcome back to Ben's Book Club. Today we are diving into the book Shelf Life. Does Democracy Have an Expiration Date? If you've been doom scrolling lately and wondering why everything feels so fragile, this explainer is definitely for you. We're going to look closely at the systems and architecture of it all, completely avoiding any partisan finger-pointing. Instead, we're diving into the very real structural forces that make modern democratic decline feel almost inevitable to so many of us right now. It's so easy to get caught up in the daily news cycle, but when you zoom out and look at the actual machinery of how we govern ourselves, you start to see a completely different picture.
Okay, let's dive into this. The authors present a really counterintuitive premise right out of the gate. We hear all the time that the system is dying, right? But the source material argues that our system isn't dead at all. Rather, it's just stuck in its first act, and because it hasn't evolved, it's spoiling over time, kind of like milk left out on the counter. It's a bold reframing. Think about it. You don't throw out your entire refrigerator just because a carton of milk went bad on the shelf. You learn to manage the temperature. This shift in perspective is absolutely crucial. It moves us away from total despair and guides us toward a clear, diagnostic look at what happens when a complex system simply stops adapting to its environment.
Section 1. The expiration date metaphor. And this brilliantly illustrates a common trap we fall into. We have this massive tendency to treat democracy as an end state of human history, as a permanent monument carved in granite that just exists indefinitely once you establish it. But it's actually a highly managed, delicate ecosystem. It requires continuous upkeep and precise environmental conditions to stay fresh. Without that active maintenance, entropy just wins out. When we imagine a system failing, we usually picture a cinematic explosion, a sudden coup, a military takeover, or a dictator seizing power overnight in a dramatic television broadcast. But the reality of modern decline is erosion. It's a slow, quiet, structural degradation. The system continues to run on paper. Elections happen on schedule. Courts convene in their usual chambers. But the internal mechanisms rot away beneath the surface. And that leads to a profound loss of shared reality and complete institutional capture.
Section 2. The 5 decay pillars.
The authors break down this spoilage into 5 structural pillars that are currently rotting away simultaneously. First up is politicized truth. Think about your own social media feed for a second. How often are we debating actual policy versus debating basic facts and what reality actually is? Second is institutional capture. This is where courts and election mechanics are seen not as neutral referees, but as partisan weapons which completely collapses public buy-in. Third, we have misaligned incentives, meaning our political systems actively reward short-term polarization and outrage over long-term stability. Fourth is algorithmic exploitation, where adversaries use information operations to actively turn citizens against each other. And fifth, fractured identity. The loss of shared physical and social spaces leaves us viewing our political opposition not as competitors in a healthy debate, but as existential threats. The vital takeaway here is that structural incentives and algorithms actively reward extreme behavior. Outrage is simply way more profitable than stability.
Which brings us to this powerful observation that captures the death of shared reality perfectly. Our digital society moves at lightning speed, entirely driven by the modern attention economy. We all have smartphones in our pockets that can process billions of calculations a second, yet we are managing our society with institutional hardware designed by guys in powdered wigs back in the 1700s. The authors argue forcefully that democracy cannot function without an agreed-upon reality. If two halves of a country live in completely different information universes, constantly fed by algorithms that only confirm their existing biases, compromise doesn't just become difficult, it becomes mathematically impossible. You cannot negotiate a shared future if you do not inhabit a shared present.
Section 3. Stuck in Act 1.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it diagnoses the current mood. It's incredibly easy to look around and assume the public is just apathetic or lazy, right? But the authors argue they aren't apathetic at all. We're actually suffering from learned helplessness. People care deeply about their communities, but they've been structurally conditioned to believe their role ends entirely at the ballot box. We can see this play out in the proposed transition from Act 1 to Act 2. Act 1 gave us representative democracy. And look, universal suffrage and regular voting were an extraordinary success for their time. But relying solely on a ballot box once every few years treats the public like passive clients to be managed by political professionals. It leaves people feeling totally powerless between elections. The authors argue for an urgent pivot to a second act, a deliberative model that gives ordinary people real structured responsibility and treats the public as active partners in governance.
Section 4. Designing a second act. Let's move to this next idea and see how this builds. Because the crucial question is, how do we actually refrigerate the system before it turns completely sour? How do we build this second act in a practical way? The mechanism they propose is deliberative democracy.
Now, this isn't just your standard boring town hall where the loudest voice in the room wins out. It involves randomly selected citizens' assemblies that genuinely reflect the demographic makeup of the broader population. These citizens learn together, they hear from experts, they weigh incredibly complex trade-offs, and they produce visible, impactful policy recommendations. Framing it this way does two huge things. It builds the muscle memory of agency within the public, and it serves as a powerful bulwark against oligarchy, stepping in precisely when elected bodies become captured by narrow, concentrated interests.
If you're sitting there wondering if ordinary people can actually govern better than we assume, the evidence says yes. Look at Ireland. For decades, politicians wouldn't touch issues like same-sex marriage or abortion. It was considered total political suicide, and the country faced severe legislative stalemates. Politicians were completely stuck, but by pulling together 99 randomly selected ordinary citizens in a room with experts, treating them essentially like a policy jury with facilitated deliberation, they broke those stalemates. They produced nuanced, publicly trusted recommendations that ultimately changed their constitution. It proves that when given structure, good information, and time, everyday people are highly capable of nuanced compromise.
So why aren't we doing this everywhere? Simply put, follow the money. The status quo fiercely resists change. We pour billions of dollars into partisan competition, campaigns, endless attack ads, elections, because the current system is perfectly optimized for concentrated control and client management. Meanwhile, the budget for actually talking to each other, for ongoing public deliberation and citizens' assemblies, is practically zero. Politicians and major parties benefit from asking the public merely to choose leaders rather than actually trusting them to shape agendas. Funding conflict is currently much more lucrative than funding consensus.
Section 5. Extending the shelf life.
So, the crucial point is this. The goal is to fix the structural rot and prove that the public is a vast resource to be harnessed, not some dangerous risk to be managed. We have concrete mechanisms available right now. Cities and communities can deploy citizens' assemblies with real binding mandates. They can establish democratic action funds simply by reallocating a small slice of massive election budgets toward public deliberation. They can use service ballots where citizens volunteer for local governance. And they can implement civic lotteries, which work a bit like jury duty but for local problem solving, to ensure we aren't just hearing from the loudest, usual voices who show up to city council meetings. This is exactly how we rebuild democratic fitness and shift from treating citizens as clients to treating them as true essential partners.
Which leaves us with this to ponder. If you had to pick the single biggest factor pushing democracy toward its expiration date, algorithmic rage, institutional decay, or economic inequality, which would it be? Think about how these forces shape your own civic reality and what your role might be in that second act. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Subscribe so you don't miss an episode.